Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Recently, we were in Low Country, Savannah, Georgia. Some friends showed me an antique desk. They call it a planter's desk. I think you're going to like it, and we're going to build one today right here.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a workshop when the last tool is put down for good. It is not the silence of a lunch break or a finished project. It is the silence of finality, the kind that lingers in sawdust and hangs from the rafters like old cobwebs. That is the silence that descended on a 936-square-foot barn in Massachusetts sometime in 2009, when the new Yankee Workshop quietly filmed its last episode after 21 seasons on public television. No tearful finale. No send-off special. No thank you speech to the millions of hobbyists who had spent their Saturday mornings watching a man in a flannel shirt turn raw lumber into furniture worthy of a museum. The show simply stopped, and the woodworking world was left to wonder what had really happened to the most beloved workshop in television history. The question has never fully gone away. Type Norm Abram's name into any search engine today and you will find countless people still asking the same thing: why did the new Yankee Workshop end? The answers that circulate online range from vague to outright inaccurate, mixing speculation with rumor in equal measure. The truth, as is almost always the case, is less dramatic than the internet suggests but far more interesting than a simple retirement story. The ending of the new Yankee Workshop was the product of at least three distinct forces colliding at exactly the same moment in time, and understanding those forces requires understanding not just a television show, but an entire era of American craftsmanship culture. To begin with the most concrete factor, you have to look at the economic landscape of 2008 and 2009. The Great Recession did not politely knock before entering. It kicked the door down. The housing market, which had been the engine driving the entire home improvement and DIY industry for more than a decade, collapsed with stunning speed. For a show like the new Yankee Workshop, which depended heavily on corporate sponsorships from major tool manufacturers and hardware suppliers, this was not merely inconvenient. It was existential. Companies like Delta, Porter Cable, and Vermont American had been steady financial partners with the production throughout much of its run. These were not small contributions. The new Yankee Workshop was a high-production value program produced through WGBH Boston, one of the most respected public broadcasting stations in the country, and maintaining that level of quality required significant ongoing investment from the corporate partners whose products appeared in the shop. When the construction industry ground to a halt and tool companies began slashing their marketing budgets, the financial architecture that had supported the show for 2 decades simply could not hold. The numbers stopped working, and when the numbers stopped working in television production, the cameras stopped rolling. But to blame the recession alone would be to tell only a fraction of the story, because the money was the trigger, not the underlying cause. The deeper truth is that by 2009, Norm Abram had been operating at a level of sustained professional output that very few people in any field managed for even half as long. Consider what he had actually been doing since 1979. He joined this old house in its very first season as the master carpenter, meaning he was present at the literal birth of the how-to-television genre as we know it. Then in 1989, rather than simply riding the wave of that show's considerable success, he took on the additional responsibility of carrying an entirely separate program, one where he was not a supporting cast member but the sole on-screen talent, the writer, the demonstrator, the teacher, and the standard-bearer all at once. For 21 seasons of the new Yankee Workshop, Norm's preparation process was not what viewers saw on screen. What viewers saw was the polished, confident final performance. What they did not see was that Norm built every single project twice. The first time was a complete prototype, constructed entirely off-camera in his own time, using less expensive secondary woods to work out every measurement, every sequence of operations, every potential problem. Only after that prototype was complete would he reverse engineer the project into the measured drawings that were later sold to viewers. Only then would the cameras roll for the production version. This process, which is part of what made the show so extraordinarily reliable and informative, also meant that Norm was doing the equivalent of 2 full-time jobs within the space that most people would consider one. By the time he was 59 years old and the final season of the show was winding down, Norm Abram had spent his entire adult working life under either the hot lights of a television studio or the sawdust of a working shop that also happened to function as a television studio. The mental and physical toll of being the man who does not make mistakes on camera for over 2 decades is not something that can be easily quantified, but it was real. Norm was a perfectionist operating in a medium that records every hesitation and broadcasts every error to an audience of millions. He had set the bar so high, for himself and for everyone watching, that the weight of that standard had become its own kind of labor. He was not burned out in the way that word is sometimes used carelessly. He was more precisely exhausted in the way that only sustained excellence at the highest level of a craft can exhaust a person. He had given everything the show required of him, and he had done it without cutting corners, and at some point, the honest reckoning with his own limits became impossible to ignore. There is also a dimension to this story that involves the broader media environment of the late 2000s, and it is a dimension that the woodworking community sometimes overlooks because it is less emotionally satisfying than the other explanations. By 2009, YouTube had evolved from a platform for amateur video clips into something genuinely threatening to the traditional educational television model. Instructional content was being democratized at a pace that no one in public broadcasting had fully anticipated. The era of the single authoritative voice, the expert who came to you once a week through a carefully produced half-hour program and taught you the right way to do something, was beginning to give way to a much noisier and more fragmented landscape of creators who were cheaper to watch, faster to update, and less formal in their presentation. Russell Morrish, the visionary producer who had invented the how-to genre with Julia Child's cooking programs decades earlier and who had shepherded both This Old House and the new Yankee Workshop to their respective heights, understood what was happening. The choice that the production team faced was not simply whether to keep the show going. It was whether to compromise the show's standards to survive in an environment where the audience's attention was being pulled in directions that rewarded speed and immediacy over depth and precision. The decision that was ultimately made, to let the series end as a completed and coherent body of work rather than allow it to slowly degrade into something lesser, was in many ways the most Norm Abram decision possible. It was the choice of a craftsman who understood that a finished piece is better than a half-finished one that gets abandoned, and that a well-made thing should be put down clean rather than run into the ground. What is often missing from discussions about the end of the show is any serious engagement with what Norm Abram actually chose to do next, because his post-New Yankee Workshop life reveals quite a bit about which parts of his television career he had genuinely loved and which parts had worn on him most heavily. He stayed on with This Old House. That is the telling detail. This Old House is a collaborative production where Norm was always one voice among several, sharing the screen and the workload with general contractors, plumbing experts, landscape designers, and hosts. It was never a solo show, and it never required him to be the singular source of all knowledge and all demonstration. His continued presence there, which lasted well over a decade after the new Yankee Workshop concluded, suggests strongly that his departure from the Workshop series was not a retreat from television or from the public sharing of his craft. It was a retreat from the specific and crushing burden of being a one-man show, of carrying every cut, every measurement, every spoken word, and every finished project entirely on his own shoulders with no one else to share the weight. In 2022, his formal departure from This Old House was marked by a tribute that the industry called The House That Norm Built, an acknowledgement from his peers that his contribution to American home improvement culture was singular and irreplaceable. Since then, Norm has lived privately, which seems entirely fitting for a man whose public persona was always more about the work than about the celebrity. There have been the inevitable internet rumors, the occasional false reports about his health, the clickbait that attaches itself to any beloved public figure who chooses privacy over continued visibility. None of it has the ring of truth or the weight of evidence. What seems far more likely, based on everything that is actually known about the man, is that Norm Abram is doing exactly what he always said brought him the most satisfaction, working with wood, at his own pace, without cameras, without producers, without a production schedule, and without the obligation to build every piece perfectly the first time on camera for an audience of millions. The legacy of the new Yankee Workshop in the years since it ended has followed a trajectory that would have been very difficult to predict in 2009. For several years, the episodes were genuinely hard to find. DVD sets circulated among dedicated fans, and grainy recordings appeared on early video platforms, but the show existed largely in the memories of the people who had watched it rather than as an active cultural presence. That has changed considerably. The official New Yankee Workshop YouTube channel has been uploading restored versions of the classic episodes, and the response has been remarkable not because the original audience has come back to relive a nostalgic experience, but because an entirely new generation of viewers has discovered the show for the first time and found something in it that contemporary content cannot provide. The comments on these restored episodes are full of people who were not born when the series premiered, young woodworkers and curious non-woodworkers alike, who describe watching Norm as a meditative and calming experience in a media landscape that otherwise seems designed to be as fast and stimulating as possible. The irony is sharp. The very qualities that made the new Yankee Workshop feel slightly out of step with the changing media environment in 2009 are the qualities that make it feel essential and even revolutionary to viewers encountering it in the mid-2020s. The woodworking content world that exists today on YouTube and other platforms is enormous and genuinely impressive in its range and creativity. There are creators who work exclusively with hand tools, creators who embrace CNC technology and digital fabrication, creators who specialize in furniture restoration, and creators who build everything from timber frame structures to delicate marquetry. Almost all of them, when asked about their influences, eventually arrive at Norm Abram. He is the common ancestor of the entire ecosystem, the person who proved that woodworking was a subject worthy of serious, sustained, high-quality television coverage, and who built an audience large enough to make the case to an entire generation that making things with your hands was not a relic of a pre-industrial past but one of the most satisfying things a modern person could do with their free time. The actual reason the new Yankee Workshop ended, then, is not a single thing. It is the convergence of a financial crisis that removed the sponsorship infrastructure the show depended on, a 21-year accumulation of personal and professional exhaustion from one of the most demanding solo television formats ever attempted, a deliberate and dignified choice to preserve the show's integrity rather than diminish it, and the quiet wisdom of a man who understood better than most that knowing when to put a tool down is as important as knowing how to use it. Norm Abram did not fail. The show did not fail. What ended was a particular arrangement of circumstances that had made the show possible, and the people responsible for it chose to honor what it had been rather than compromise what it stood for. The barn doors closed, but the work that happened inside those doors is still teaching people, still inspiring people, and still opening garage doors on Saturday mornings all across the country.